Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into something that is just one of the most remarkable phenomena in human history. We're talking about the explosive growth of the early Christian church. I mean, how did this happen? We're digging into the mechanics of evangelism in the first, 3 centuries? And our sources, they lay out a really clear mission for us. We need to figure out how this tiny, seemingly insignificant group from a fringe Roman province somehow became a world faith in just a few generations. What were the exact ingredients?
It's absolutely essential to start by framing this whole thing against the world they lived in. Michael Green's work, which we're leaning on, really emphasizes going back to first principles. The early Christian world had these fascinating similarities to ours, a single language pretty much everywhere, easy travel, and this broad disillusionment with the old ways of thinking. But the differences, the challenges they were up against, they were just enormous. And understanding both sides of that coin, the opportunity and the opposition, that's the key.
And right at the start, the sources point out this huge problem that separates them from us. They call it the double loss. Today, you often see passionate people who, they want to share their faith, but maybe lack the deep theology. And then you have the theologians who have all the knowledge, but they avoid the practical work of engaging with people.
Precisely. In the early church, that was unthinkable. The person doing the work on the ground was the theologian. The message and the method were completely inseparable.
A kind of structural integrity.
Yes, that unity of theory and practice, that's maybe the first big lesson we pull from this. They weren't just following a plan, they were living a synthesized truth.
Okay, so let's get into the context, the things that sort of paved the way for them, these unconscious aids. What was the biggest geopolitical factor that gave them, room to grow?
Oh, it has to be the Pax Romana. The Roman peace. It was unparalleled in history. For nearly 200 years, the Mediterranean world was, for the most part, stable, one government. And that political unity, that's the foundation for everything else that follows.
And unity means security, it means infrastructure. The famous Roman road system, right?
Mm-hmm.
The one that literally radiated out from the Golden Milestone in Rome.
Exactly. It was an engineering marvel. It was built for troops, for imperial news. But the Christians, they completely exploited it.
How so?
Well, just think about the safety and the sheer speed of travel. One source we have mentions an inscription from a merchant who traveled to Rome 72 times.
72 times.
72 times. That level of mobility for people, for goods, and, for ideas was totally unheard of. So if a merchant could use that system for profit, the early believers realized they could use it for proclamation.
It's like an unconscious strategy. Go where the roads go.
That's it.
So beyond the logistics, there was a cultural accelerator, the Greek language.
Koine Greek. It was the common tongue all around the Mediterranean, thanks to Alexander the Great centuries before.
And it wasn't just useful, it was almost perfectly suited for the job.
It was. Greek is such a sensitive, adaptable language. It was just ideal for conveying these really nuanced philosophical and theological ideas. It already had this huge vocabulary from centuries of thinkers, so the early church could just plug right into it.
Which brings us to Greek philosophy itself.
Yeah.
It almost acted as a preparatio evangelica, right? A preparation for the gospel. How did it prepare people?
It did the demolition work first. Thinkers like Plato had already spent ages exposing the moral flaws of the old gods, the cruelties, the adulteries.
The embarrassing story.
The very embarrassing story. So any thoughtful, educated person in the Roman Empire already knew the old myths were just insufficient. They were hungry for something more.
So Greek philosophy created a kind of spiritual vacuum.
It created an intellectual hunger. The educated classes were already kind of moving toward monotheism, or at least the idea of a single unifying deity. But, and this is a huge but, the god of the philosophers was usually this cold, mathematical, final cause.
Distant, impersonal.
Totally impersonal. And then the Judeo-Christian message comes in with this personal, intervening, redeeming creator God. That was the crucial upgrade.
Okay, so you have this amazing set of conditions. Infrastructure, language, philosophy, all pointing in the right direction. But here's the paradox. The message itself was deeply offensive. The minute they opened their mouths, they hit a wall. Why were they seen as, antisocial, atheistic, even depraved?
Because the core of their message was a cultural insult, a complete scandal. They were preaching a crucified criminal.
The worst possible death.
The worst, reserved for slaves and traitors. It meant total defeat and humiliation. So for the Greeks, with their love of wisdom, this was just foolishness. For the Romans who valued strength, it was weakness. And for the Jews, it was blasphemy. Pure monotheism couldn't allow for a deified man, let alone one who died under God's curse.
A stumbling block for everyone, but for different reasons.
For everyone.
So let's break down the language they use to actually get this shocking idea across. The sources point to three big clusters of words.
Right. The first one is euangelistai, to tell good news. And this really emphasizes how Christ-centered the message was. The good news wasn't just about Jesus. It was Jesus. Origen later called him the autobasile, the kingdom in person.
Wow. Okay, so it's a person you encounter, not a doctrine you learn.
Exactly. Then the second word is kerusso, which means to proclaim, like a herald's public announcement. This gives it authority, it's identifiable, it's specific, it's not some, private little mystery cult.
And the third?
The third is martyrine, to bear witness. And this is really a legal term. It grounds the whole thing in reality. It's about personal involvement with and assurance of historical facts, specifically the resurrection. They were eyewitnesses.
In this message, this proclamation, it came with these incredibly demanding ethics, which must have been another huge barrier.
A massive barrier. It demanded a totally different way of life. Chastity, self-control, a genuine love for your neighbor, including the poor, the foreigner.
Which was not the Roman way.
Not at all. I mean, it was so far beyond the standards of the day. Roman high society practiced prostitution, child exposure, cruelty as entertainment. So becoming a Christian meant a definite radical break with your past.
And that break wasn't just a moral choice, was it? It was an economic and political risk.
Oh, an existential risk.
Yeah.
You had to refuse to participate in the imperial cult, which was basically a mandatory loyalty oath. And then, to get a job, you often had to belong to a trade guild.
Right.
But those guilds had these cult meals that involved idolatry. If you refused to go, you lost your livelihood. You lost your social standing.
Right.
You could lose your life. The ethics were the razor's edge they lived on.
So how did they do it? Let's talk about methods. They started as, what, nobodies from a backwater province.
Complete nobodies. But we see strategy at both the macro and the micro level.
Okay, let's start macro. Paul's provincial strategy.
Right. Paul was a genius. He didn't try to go to every single village. He'd focus on key urban centers in a province, say Thessalonica, Berea, and Philippi in Macedonia. He'd set up 2 or 3 faith communities, and then he'd rely on the new local converts to spread the message from there.
So it's a hub-and-spoke model.
It's a hub-and-spoke model, yeah. And it followed the natural geographical and trade routes, always centered on the big urban hubs, Alexandria, Carthage, Ephesus.
And the micro-level tactics,
Yeah.
the actual person-to-person engagement. I find this fascinating because they didn't have church buildings for the first 2 centuries.
No, they didn't. So all the evangelism happened on, secular ground.
Like where?
Laundries, street corners, wine bars. They'd hold these small open-air gatherings, and the sources suggest they were really creative. They'd use drama, dance, maybe even juggling, anything to get people's attention. And it was all done with this humor and lightness of touch.
That's not the image most people have. It sounds almost like ancient street theater.
It was. But what was maybe even more effective was just personal conversation. One-on-one. This was the most natural way to do it. You could go at the listener's pace.
Are there examples of that?
Oh, absolutely. We read about the great theologian Origen personally spending time evangelizing a man named Gregory, or Minucius Felix's dialogue, The Octavius, which is basically a story of one friend talking to another about his faith during a walk. It was just part of life.
And what about the intellectuals, the educated elites?
They met them on their own turf. Paul would rent out lecture halls like the Hall of Tyrannus in Ephesus and just hold these long-form intellectual discussions. And guys like Justin Martyr, who was a philosopher himself, he would argue that Christianity wasn't some strange new sect. It was the true philosophy.
The fulfillment of what Plato was searching for.
Exactly.
And then there's the last tactic, which might have been the most effective of all, household penetration.
Absolutely crucial. The home was the medium. If the head of the household, the paterfamilias, converted, like the centurion Cornelius, it often meant the whole household followed. The wife, the kids, the freedmen, and the slaves.
And the slaves and freedmen were a key part of this.
So they were the secret ingredient. They worked inside these aristocratic families as cooks, tutors, administrators. They were legally things, not people, but they were trusted. And they were the pathway for the gospel to get into the highest levels of Roman society.
Wow. So the message travels from the bottom up, inside the very structure of Roman power.
Precisely. That's how you get Christians inside Caesar's own household, or a prominent figure like Flavia Domitilla, a relative of the emperor, becoming a believer.
Okay, so we've got the context, the message, the methods, but what was it, according to the sources, that actually convinced people? What was the thing that made them look at this and say, this is real?
In a word, transformation. People weren't just impressed by arguments, they were impressed by lives that were qualitatively, visibly changed. Well, think of John. He was called the Son of Thunder, probably had a terrible temper, but he becomes known as the Apostle of Love. Or Justin Martyr's own life story. People could just see the difference it made.
And that wasn't just an individual thing, it was corporate. The church community itself was different.
It was revolutionary, unparalleled.
Yeah.
You had masters and slaves, rich and poor, Jew and Gentile, all sitting together, eating together. That wasn't just tolerance, it was a display of genuine love. And it overflowed. They were famous for their service to outsiders, especially during plagues when everyone else, including the authorities, just fled the cities.
You also mentioned divine power. The signs and wonders, healing, exorcism. How important was that?
Oh, it was massive. You have to remember the first century was gripped by fear of fate, fear of spiritual forces, the daimonia. So when Christians performed healings and exorcisms, it was proof that Jesus was Lord, that he was the master of destiny.
It was a power encounter.
A huge power encounter. It offered a kind of liberation that philosophy and the old gods just couldn't deliver. It was an enormous appeal.
And finally, there's just their raw courage. I mean, they faced constant ridicule.
Utterly dangerous. Tertullian wrote that Christians rejoice to be his disciples and in his name to suffer. Their confidence, especially in the face of death, was just baffling to the Romans. There's that chilling graffito found on the Palatine Hill in Rome.
Yeah, describe that for us.
It's just a crude scratching on a wall. It shows a young man, Aleximenos, worshiping a crucified figure who has the head of a donkey, and the inscription says, Aleximenos worships his god.
Wow.
It's pure mockery, total contempt, linking them to superstition, even animal worship. It shows you what they were up against every single day, and yet the faith kept spreading.
So they're facing that mockery, ruin, death. What was the engine? What was the motivation?
It was, I think, a moving allegiance to a God they believed had acted in history, a profound sense of personal discovery, and this deep, inescapable concern for people who didn't know Christ. That spiritual intensity is what drove them to use every single method available to make him known. So if you want to synthesize it all for yourself, it looks like this. The early evangelism had this basic homogeneity of message. It was always Christ-centered. But that message was delivered with an incredible variety of methods. They used every cultural pathway they could find. And the goal was always a decisive turning to Christ, marked by repentance, faith, and then this visible transformation in how you lived your life.
And the lesson for us really seems to be that it was their will to speak of their Lord, that burning motivation that really impressed people more than any one specific technique they used. They were masters of being faithful to their theology while being incredibly adaptable to their culture.
Right. And that adaptability, it wasn't easy. They really struggled with how to translate the gospel into new frameworks without losing it completely. They had to fight things like Gnosticism or new kinds of legalism, which, it raises a question for you as you think about all this. How can knowledge about something profound, something foundational, be translated or adapted for a modern skeptical audience without compromising its original essential content? That's the tension they lived in, and it's one we still live in today.